There comes a moment in every generation when people must pause long enough to listen not to the noise of the world, not to the shouts of division or the whispers of doubt, but to something deep, something that rises from within and calls us toward a future greater than anything we were taught to expect. And in Africa's story, that calling has always come through the power of language. It is easy to overlook language because we use it every day without thinking. But language is more than communication. It is identity, memory, history, and direction. It shapes how we think, how we see ourselves, and how we imagine the possibilities ahead. When people lose their language, they lose a piece of their soul, but when they reclaim it, when they speak with intention, when they rediscover the voice that was buried under years of silence, they become unstoppable. Across the African continent, there are over 2,000 languages, each one a world, each one a storehouse of wisdom, each one a living testament to the creativity, resilience, and brilliance of the people who speak it. But in a continent so linguistically rich, there is also a challenge. How do you build unity without erasing diversity? How do you create one voice while honoring the thousands that came before? The answer is not to force one language on millions, but to develop a voice that represents a shared future, a Pan-African voice built not from replacing identity but elevating it. For generations, outsiders tried to convince Africans that their languages were inferior, insufficient, too complicated, too fragmented, too unorganized to shape modern civilization, but they said that because they understood the secret that too many Africans didn't. Language holds power. If you want to weaken a people, take their voice. If you want to confuse a people, divide their expression. And if you ever want to dominate a people, make them ashamed of their own mother tongue. The world knows the power of a unified voice. It is why nations protect their language, promote it, teach it, and export it. Because language isn't just a tool, it's a weapon, a foundation, a strategy. Africa has been forced for too long to operate using borrowed languages. Languages that carry foreign memories, foreign values, foreign worldviews, and foreign priorities. There is nothing wrong with learning global languages. It can open doors. But the danger comes when those doors become cages, when a continent forgets that it once spoke with pride, clarity, precision, and power long before anyone else tried to teach it how to speak. Imagine for a moment what it would look like if Africa rediscovered the power of its own voice. Imagine a continent where children grow up speaking their mother tongue with pride, while learning a common Pan-African language that connects them to brothers and sisters across borders. Imagine countries no longer communicating through languages imposed by history, but through languages chosen for the future. Imagine African universities teaching science, philosophy, medicine, mathematics, politics, and innovation using African languages, not translated secondhand from another worldview, but expressed directly from the depth of African thought. Imagine African leaders addressing the world, not in borrowed tones, but in a language carried from the soil beneath their feet, a language that holds generations of knowledge, rhythm, and truth. Imagine artists, filmmakers, poets, educators, and inventors sharing a unified cultural voice that stretches from Cape Town to Cairo, from Lagos to Nairobi, from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Africa would not just be a continent, it would be a choir, and every nation would be a different instrument playing the same song of progress. But unity does not begin with governments, it begins with people. It begins with recognizing that the languages spoken across Africa are not obstacles, they are assets. They are proof of complexity, not a sign of weakness. They show that Africa is not a continent without identity, but a continent with thousands of identities, and that diversity is exactly what makes unity possible. Because unity built on force collapses, but unity built on respect endures. If Africa chooses one common language, whether Swahili or another unifying tongue, it will not erase others, it will amplify them. It will allow a Ghanaian child to understand a Kenyan child without both needing to speak a language tied to colonial memory. It will allow a South African engineer to collaborate with an Ethiopian scientist without translating their brilliance through someone else's filter. It will allow African countries to trade faster, communicate better, negotiate stronger, and stand taller on the world stage. Language is not just connection, it is strategy, it is infrastructure, it is liberation. There is a reason why the world fears an Africa that speaks with one voice. A united Africa is harder to manipulate, harder to divide, harder to infiltrate, harder to control. When people share a language, they share vision. When they share vision, they build power. And power is something the world has always tried to keep out of Africa's reach. But that power already exists. It is simply waiting to be awakened. The question is whether this generation is bold enough to awaken it. The future of Africa will belong to those who understand the value of cultural intelligence, not just technological intelligence. It will belong to the young people who realize that knowing their language gives them a competitive advantage the world cannot duplicate. It will belong to the children who grow up speaking an African language at home, a Pan-African language in school, and global languages when necessary, not because they are running from their identity but because they are expanding it. It will belong to the leaders who understand that unity is not built on sameness but shared direction, and it will belong to the visionaries who recognize that African languages do not need permission to be powerful. They only need to be spoken. When Africans speak their languages again with confidence, something changes inside them. Their shoulders rise, their spirit straightens, they stand with a dignity that cannot be borrowed. They speak with a strength that cannot be translated. They walk with the memory of millions who came before them, because language carries the footsteps of ancestors. Every word spoken in an African tongue is a reminder that the world may have tried to break Africa, but Africa's voice never disappeared. It only waited, and now it is time for it to rise again, not as a whisper, but as a force. But let us be clear. Unity through language is not about erasing differences. Africa's beauty is its diversity. This continent was never meant to sound the same. It was meant to sing in harmony. What a Pan-African voice does is provide the rhythm, the foundation, the shared melody upon which every other voice can rise. This is how a continent becomes unstoppable. Not through uniformity but through unity. When Africa speaks together, it will create a sound the world cannot ignore. So the challenge today is simple but powerful. Reclaim your language, learn it, speak it, teach it, honor it, and at the same time embrace the possibility of a unifying tongue that connects the continent. Do not believe the lie that Africa is too divided to unite. Division is manufactured, unity is natural. It comes the moment Africans decide they have been silent long enough. It comes the moment they realize that identity is a foundation, not an option. It comes the moment they understand that the same language is used to separate can now be used to gather. Every movement begins with a voice, and the voice that will shape Africa's future is already here. It lives in you. It lives in the millions who speak with pride, who refuse to let their identity be erased, who know that the future does not belong to those who imitate others but to those who rediscover themselves. When Africa finds its voice again, not the one written for it, but the one written within it, no force on earth will be able to silence it, because a continent that speaks in unity cannot be broken, a people who understand their identity cannot be defeated, and a generation that chooses its own voice will always rise higher than those who relied on someone else's. This is the power of language, this is the strength of unity, and this is the future waiting for Africa, if it chooses to speak. The greatest unclaimed power in Africa is its own voice, a power that has waited patiently beneath the surface of history, untouched, underestimated, and misunderstood. When you look across the vastness of the continent, from the deserts of the north to the forests of the Congo, from the shores of West Africa to the mountains in the east, you see a land that has never lacked brilliance, wisdom, or expression. What it lacked was unity, not because the people were divided by spirit, but because they were divided by languages that were stripped away, discouraged, and replaced over centuries. Yet inside every African today, whether on the continent or across the diaspora, there is a voice still echoing from the ancestors, waiting to be reclaimed. That voice is not just sound, it is identity, dignity, history, and an entire worldview carried in words older than pyramids and older than the very nations that now shape the world. When a people lose their language, they lose the roadmap to themselves. But when they recover it, they recover everything that was once taken: confidence, direction, connection, and power. Unity begins not with grand political plans or international agreements, but with something simple and profound: rediscovering the languages that once connected villages, families, and kingdoms. A language is more than vocabulary. It is the rhythm of a people's thoughts, the way they structure meaning, the way they describe love, struggle, hope, and destiny. African languages are not just systems of communication, they are keys to memory. They hold stories of migrations, ancient inventions, medical knowledge, spiritual philosophies, and survival techniques. When an African child grows up speaking the tongue of their ancestors, they grow up with a sense of place, a sense of belonging, and a sense of continuity with those who walked before them. This is the foundation of unity. Without language, a people becomes scattered in spirit, even when they live in the same land. But with language reclaimed, they become a community again, able to dream together, build together, and rise together. The tragedy is that many Africans today know more foreign languages than their own indigenous ones. This isn't a mistake. It is the result of centuries of colonization, systems that made the African voice seem inferior, while elevating languages that had no connection to African soil. This created generations of Africans who could speak fluently to the world, but struggled to speak deeply to themselves. Yet the beauty of Africa is resilience. Languages that were silenced refused to disappear. They live quietly in songs, in proverbs, in the laughter of elders, in the rituals that survived even when everything else was stripped away. And now the world is watching a new awakening. Young Africans are learning Yoruba, Igbo, Swahili, Amharic, Wolof, Zulu, and dozens more, not because they are forced to, but because they are hungry for the missing pieces of their identity. Every time someone chooses to speak an African language, they are not just speaking, they are rebuilding. When Africans speak to each other without translation, they unlock a future the world never prepared for. Imagine a continent where cross-border connections are not limited by unfamiliar tongues, where trade, collaboration, innovation, and unity happen as naturally as conversation. A shared African linguistic foundation, whether through the revival of indigenous languages or the adoption of a Pan-African language, like Swahili, could create an intellectual and cultural powerhouse. Language becomes a bridge that allows ideas to travel faster, trust to grow deeper, and progress to strength. If Africans can speak to each other directly, without relying on languages imposed from the outside, then no foreign system can insert itself between them, mistranslate their intentions, or divide their aspirations. This is the fear many external forces had for generations: an Africa fully connected, communicating seamlessly, sharing knowledge freely, and moving as one collective mind. A continent that rediscovers its shared language will rise with a strength no system can divide. Unity rooted in language is unity that cannot be manipulated, because it comes from identity, not politics. It forms bonds between nations the way family bonds form between siblings, not through contracts but through heritage. When you share a language, you share meaning, you share emotion, you share worldview. This is why nations around the world fiercely protect their languages. They know that language is the backbone of power. Africa is beginning to recognize this truth again, and as languages return, so does pride, so does clarity, so does unity. The future of Africa will not only be shaped by technology, economics, or policy, it will be shaped by voices reclaiming the words that once built empires and civilizations long before global powers existed. What the world sees today is only the beginning of Africa's linguistic renaissance. The diaspora, too, is waking up. People whose ancestors were taken across oceans are beginning to learn the languages their great-grandparents were forbidden to speak. This is one of the most powerful acts of healing, restoring a voice that was stolen. Whether through DNA tests, cultural exploration, or personal curiosity, millions in the diaspora are searching for the languages that match the rhythm of their spirit. And when they learn those languages, something extraordinary happens. They reconnect with a home they have never physically seen, but spiritually recognize. They join the growing chorus of Africans reclaiming what was lost. And in that chorus is a strength that cannot be broken. Africa's unity is not a dream, it is a process, and language is the foundation. Every reclaimed word, every revived dialect, every child who learns the language of their ancestors is participating in a quiet revolution. This revolution does not require violence or resistance. It requires awareness, intention, and pride. It begins in classrooms, in households, in music, in storytelling, in online platforms, in community gatherings, and even in private self-study. It grows every time someone says, "My language matters." It becomes unstoppable when millions speak that truth. The continent is healing through language. The diaspora is reconnecting through language. And the future will be written not in the tongues that tried to reshape Africa, but in the languages that came from African soil itself. The greatest unclaimed power in Africa has always been its own voice. Now that voice is rising again, stronger, clearer, and more united than ever. When Africans speak to each other without translation, they unlock a future the world never prepared for, a future that feels like the rising of something ancient and unstoppable. For centuries, outsiders made decisions for Africa because they believed Africans could not communicate, coordinate, or collaborate on their own terms. They believed that dividing the continent by language would weaken it forever, but what they failed to understand is that beneath all the imposed languages, there still lived a natural rhythm, a shared structure of thought, a familiar spirit that connected people across borders even when their tongues were different. The world expected Africa to remain separated, but Africa is remembering what it once was, a continent of bridges, not barriers. When one African language meets another, there is an immediate sense of recognition. The tones, the proverbs, the way words build meaning, there is something shared, something familiar, something deeply rooted in a worldview that values community, ancestry, interconnectedness, and collective destiny. Speaking directly to each other without needing a foreign language becomes more than communication. It becomes a rediscovery. It becomes an awakening. It becomes a quiet reminder that Africa was whole before anyone told it was broken, that unity was natural long before division was introduced as a strategy, and that connection is part of the DNA of African people everywhere. Imagine traders moving across borders and negotiating in languages shaped by the continent itself. Imagine entrepreneurs from Lagos collaborating with innovators in Nairobi without switching to a European language to make their ideas understandable. Imagine leaders across the continent holding conferences conducted entirely in African languages and still understanding one another because they have invested in the revival of indigenous communication systems. This simple act would create a revolution, not of violence, not of conflict, but of clarity. It would mean Africa no longer has to translate its vision through a foreign filter. It would mean Africans speak from their own center, in their own rhythm, with their own authority. Language makes trust easier. It makes misunderstanding harder. It turns strangers into kin, because language carries more than meaning. It carries emotion, tone, humor, rhythm, and cultural cues that outsiders cannot fully interpret. When Africans speak to each other in African languages, they remove the walls that history tried to place between them. They remove the silent distance created by centuries of linguistic disruption. They remove the idea that unity requires foreign mediation. They step into a connection that feels older than memory, something inherited, something that was waiting quietly like buried treasure under the surface of time. But the power of speaking without translation is not just functional. It is deeply psychological. Speaking your own language unlocks confidence. It removes the sense of inferiority that comes from being told your expression is less sophisticated or less important. It awakens pride and identity and dignity. When an African child hears leaders, teachers, or scholars use indigenous languages in serious intellectual contexts, that child begins to see their own culture as worthy, powerful, and brilliant. This is how identity is rebuilt, not with declarations but with the everyday use of language as a tool of empowerment. A continent that can speak to itself fluently becomes a continent that can plan for itself, dream for itself, and rise for itself. The fear of outsiders was never the land, the minerals, or the population. It was the potential of Africa thinking, speaking, and acting as one. Because unity built on language is unity that no foreign force can manipulate. It becomes a natural unity. An organic unity, a unity that grows from people understanding each other at the deepest levels of expression. And the diaspora plays a powerful role in this transformation. Millions of descendants of Africa are learning the languages their ancestors once spoke before those languages were stripped away by force. They do this not because they need the language to survive in their current countries, but because something inside them longs for the sound of home. When they learn Yoruba, Igbo, Twi, Wolof, Kikongo, or Swahili, they experience something extraordinary, an inner alignment, a sudden familiarity, a sense that the missing part of their soul has returned. And when the diaspora speaks African languages, they form a bridge between continents that history once tried to break forever. As more Africans across the world learn to communicate in the tongues of their ancestors, the continent becomes less of a physical location and more of a living network. A cultural homeland that speaks across oceans. This is what the world never prepared for. An Africa that is no longer silent, no longer divided, no longer forced to listen through foreign filters. A continent that has found its voice again, and a diaspora that has found its way back home through words alone. The revival of African languages is not just linguistic, it is spiritual, cultural, academic, economic, and political. It will determine how Africans negotiate their future, how they interpret their past, and how they define themselves going forward. When Africans speak without translation, they do more than communicate. They reclaim power, they reclaim memory, they reclaim unity, and they set in motion a future that belongs to them, shaped by their own voices, carried by the strength of their own words, built on the foundation of a linguistic legacy that has survived every attempt to erase. This is the quiet revolution the world is beginning to witness. Africa learning to speak to itself again. Africa reclaiming its voice. Africa rising through language, one word, one conversation, one generation at a time. A continent that rediscovers its shared language will rise with a strength no system can divide. Because language is more than words, it is identity, memory, confidence, and the unseen cord that binds people into a single force. When a people lose their shared language, they lose the rhythm of their ancestors, the patterns of their thinking, the messages encoded in the way they greet, honor, celebrate, and mourn. But when they reclaim it, something powerful awakens, something no empire, no foreign influence, and no historical interruption can suppress. Across Africa, you see fragments of this awakening already taking place as communities reclaim naming systems, revive forgotten proverbs, restore oral traditions, and build modern platforms that elevate indigenous dialects. Every time an African child learns a word in their mother tongue, something ancient stirs a spark of dignity, a sense of belonging, a reminder that they come from a lineage that existed long before borders were drawn or languages were imposed. And that spark grows into a flame when millions do it together. A shared language has the power to erase divisions created by colonial lines, to break the false idea that Africans are too different to unite, too scattered to cooperate, or too divided to rise. A shared language becomes a bridge across tribes, cultures, and regions, transforming strangers into brothers and sisters who recognize themselves in each other. It strengthens economies by allowing faster communication. It strengthens diplomacy by removing barriers created by translation. It strengthens cultural pride by giving people a common voice. And most importantly, it strengthens the identity of the young generation, who too often grow up fluent in languages that don't reflect their heritage, while knowing almost nothing about the languages that shaped their ancestors' worldview. Reclaiming a shared language is not about erasing diversity. Africa's diversity is one of its greatest strengths. It is about building a foundation that runs beneath the diversity, a foundation strong enough to carry a continent toward unity, progress, and global influence. When a people rediscover their linguistic roots, they begin to think differently about themselves. They see their history not as a scattered set of stories, but as a single narrative of resilience. They see their present not as a series of isolated struggles, but as a shared journey. And they begin to imagine a future where cooperation is possible, because understanding is possible. Language becomes the glue that binds dreams together. A Pan-African linguistic revival is not merely academic, it is revolution. It creates pride in heritage, confidence in identity, and alignment in purpose. It becomes a tool that dismantles old stereotypes and rewrites the narrative of what Africa can achieve. And in that rediscovery, every African child gains something priceless, a sense of ownership over their story and the ability to communicate that story with power. When a continent finds its shared voice, the world begins to listen differently. Suddenly, Africa is not just speaking. It is speaking with unity, clarity, and authority. It is speaking with the weight of history and the force of 1 billion people aligned in one direction. No system built to divide them can withstand that kind of unity. Systems that thrive on misunderstanding collapse when understanding becomes widespread. Systems that survive on separation weaken when connection becomes normal. Systems that rely on confusion fall apart when clarity becomes the standard. That is why language is one of the most powerful tools of liberation. It gives people the ability to define themselves instead of being defined by others. It gives them the power to articulate their vision for the future and to negotiate their place in the world on their own terms. A shared language becomes a shield against manipulation, a sword against oppression, and a bridge toward collective progress. The rediscovery of a shared African linguistic identity is not something that happens overnight. It begins with small choice. It begins with parents teaching their children the words that shape their childhood. It begins with communities documenting their stories before they disappear. It begins with creators producing books, music, films, and digital content in languages that reflect their truth. It begins with schools valuing local languages as much as global ones. And it begins with leaders understanding that unity does not come from speeches. It comes from communication, from connection, from shared meaning. When these small choices become habits, and those habits spread across borders, something historic unfolds. A continent begins to speak with one heartbeat, a fractured identity begins to repair itself, and a people once scattered across linguistic lines begin to see themselves as part of a single powerful family with a shared destiny. When Africa rediscovers its shared language, it rediscovers its strength. And when that strength rises, no system built on division will ever be strong enough to break it again.